Mina. I want to welcome Laura, Jane, and Elliot to the room. Thank you so much for taking time to join us. And I'm looking forward to the insights that we will share. Like I mentioned before, we are trying to take it back to basics. And so as you introduce yourself, please answer this question. Can you remember when you first heard the word AI and how did you start working with it? Jane, I'll start with you.
Brilliant, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. It's lovely to see that there are so many participants on the call. When did I first hear the term AI? I mean, several years ago, several years ago. Here at Reuters, we've been using more machine learning and natural language processing forms of AI for many, many years, particularly in our financial file. And I think one of my reactions to it really was that this was a fantastic opportunity, right? To use machines to enhance our journalism and to help us to do the work here at Reuters and in the newsroom. But I got really frustrated with the word intelligence because it didn't seem very intelligent to me. And it didn't seem like anything like a human level of intelligence. And I would kind of get really frustrated because people would say, what's Reuters doing about artificial intelligence? And I kind of almost thought, not enough, you know, like it's still very much sort of hyper, very clever coding rather than any form of intelligence. And of course, that all changed almost exactly a year ago, right, with the arrival of ChatGPT into the big wide world. And I think since then, you know, it's really sort of taken over from, you asked, how did I start working with it? I mean, I started working with it in the financial file, very much being dependent on developers, being dependent on people, most of what they said I didn't understand. And I was just kind of the subject matter expert, sort of giving thumbs up and thumbs down. So it didn't feel very integrative, my experience at that stage. Whereas since ChatGPT launched, it's much more integrative. You know, this is a tool that we can all be playing with, I mean, not just ChatGPT, but all of the sort of LLM-based models. Now it does feel intelligent. Sometimes it feels very stupid still, but it does feel like we're now actually living up to the term of artificial intelligence. And I feel that many, many more of us can now get involved in working with it than was possible in the previous incarnations.
Awesome, thanks, Jane. Alid, just introduce yourself and then tell us when you came across AI and when did you start working with it? I guess you haven't really started working with it, my assumption, but yeah, do tell us your journey with AI so far.
Sure, great to be here, and thank you so much, Tshepo, and Laura and Jane, good to be here with you both, and all of our attendees. I just want to say, firstly, love the final sentiment that you left us with, Tshepo, which was be kind and be curious. I think if that's a mantra we can all live by, that is one I can get behind. When did I first hear the term AI? Honestly, probably outside of a professional context, probably in The Terminator or something like that, a long time ago in a movie. How it's actually used and how I've begun to use it, or how our teams, it's worth me sort of contextualizing who I am and what I do first, probably. So I'm one of the directors and the interim managing director of FT Strategies. We are a consulting or advisory business within the Financial Times Group. We, for the last 4 years, have been supporting the viability and sustainability and transformation, if you like, of news organizations around the world and I think we've worked with over 600 news organizations now, both in EMEA, APAC, and the Americas. So it's been a huge body of work, which has sort of exposed us to a whole raft of different challenges and opportunities that news organizations are facing in terms of how they evolve, how they grow commercially, how they grow their audiences, how they grow engagement and loyalty, and how they transform their operations to take advantage of things like generative AI and other forms of AI, as I'm sure we'll get onto. Gen AI, as Jane mentioned, has really raised up the agenda, but forms of AI are much more mature and have been around for a very, very long time. And I can speak, I guess, both from the vantage of the FT, which is a formidable news organization that we're a part of. I myself am a former journalist, and I guess once a journalist, always a journalist. But also the organizations that we've been supporting now for many years, and most recently through a big program of work as well, focusing specifically on designing and experimenting with AI as well. So how have we used it, I guess? Stretching far back, I won't go into the gritty details, but as Jane mentioned, some of the sort of the basic applications of it have still been very human-led, and so some of them would have been around improving things like monetization. So propensity modeling was probably my first exposure to it, how newsrooms were kind of grappling with patterns of behavior that their users specifically, and this is more of an issue in particular when you're focusing on reader revenue models, how patterns of behavior can be tracked and influenced in order to maintain or drive up engagement. So really using, I guess, informed and advanced data sets and machine learning around those data sets in terms of how your users and your readers or your viewers might consume your journalism or content, and how that relates to other very important things across the business, like commercial metrics around subscription lifetime value or likelihood to be acquired as a subscriber or be retained. So that's probably my first deeper exposure to it, I guess. Now, of course, it's starting to infiltrate many other different operations within the newsroom, but also within the wider news organization. And I would categorize those in terms of, I guess, 3 to 4 big buckets: content production opportunities there, monetization, within which there's a few different areas, of course, as a few of them I just mentioned. General kind of operational efficiency. I think it's being used much more so now to help with augmenting existing workflows, but driving efficiency across other areas of the business as well. And ChatGPT and not just OpenAI, but many of the other organizations who've raised it on the agenda have done a huge thing there, of basically catalyzing a mass awareness of the opportunities, but also the risks that might be inherent in it. So I guess one thing is first, and I'll leave it here for now, sorry, Laura, I've been going on a bit, is I think establishing a governance structure around it, given it is such an important thing and such a potentially opportunistic thing, is incredibly important for any organization who's hoping to use it. So that is something, I think, when it became more mainstream, that's certainly how we have adopted it at the FT, and something we encourage the clients that we help to do first and foremost.
Awesome, thanks, Elliot. Laura?
Absolutely, no need to apologise. I think we're all obsessed here. So, you know, I love hearing these framings, and they've both been incredibly useful. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Laura Ellis, and I am Head of Technology Forecasting at the BBC, which is a very peculiar title, but lovely. Wouldn't it be great if we could actually do that? And I guess, you know, thinking back to when I first heard the term AI, I guess it's probably something like the Terminator kind of, you know, era, where you start to think there's this scary intelligence potentially coming to get us. And I read Nick Bostrom's book, Superintelligence, on a flight going somewhere, and came off that flight a different person, because I thought this is going to be massively consequential for us. And at the time, I was still a journalist. I was a journalist for 30 years before I moved into tech. And I think, as you say, you never really leave it behind. And I started to wonder how AI might affect journalism, what we might do with it, and what we might need to do to protect ourselves and our audiences in an era where this was going to be interesting and important for us. So I joined a very embryonic ethics committee in the BBC, and I met a lot of people, for example, from News Labs, and I know there's some on the call, hello, which is a great bit of the BBC between R&D and news. And they were already looking at some of the applications for this. And I think we started off, you know, quite focused on personalization and how this could deliver, you know, tailored content to people. And then we started to look at things like computer vision and, you know, the pattern spotting capabilities that this had. And then also obviously language, because we work in a number of different languages. So it was really interesting to see us developing capabilities in natural language processing, understanding generation, etc. So these kind of 3 areas we're pottling along quite nicely. We've been doing some interesting things and some great pieces, not least a piece of work called Better Images of AI, because when we think of the Terminator, it is kind of terrible, isn't it? But, you know, you've got a great big scary red-eyed beast that's coming out to get us. And I know that's always going to make a better film than, you know, look at this logistic regression helping us to spot medical imaging. But, you know, it's something that we need to really think about, because as we have conversations with our audiences about AI, having those scary images or the blue glowing brain that we always have is probably not helpful. We need to see people using it. We need to see people engaging with it. And after a little while, just towards the end of my sort of like formal journalistic career, I began to be known as that robot woman, which is always a bit worrying when you're not doing anything with robotics. You just happen to have a bit of an interest in AI. So I think again, that's a measure of how people are a bit sort of like a bit nervous and find it a bit difficult to kind of engage with at times. And we have big responsibilities to make sure that doesn't happen. And all the work that you're doing, Tshepo, it's just amazing, and I massively admire it, and I think it has a huge role to play in helping us to communicate this stuff as it moves very fast, and in some ways in quite alarming ways that we need to get our heads around. So yes, thank you. Really good to be here.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much. I'm interested to know what are some of the myths, misconceptions that you've come across in your newsrooms from various people from various departments around AI and journalism, especially now in the time of generative AI. Laura, you can begin.
So you just dropped out slightly. Say that first bit again. The challenges, did you say?
The misconceptions.
Misconceptions. Right. Yeah. Okay.
In your newsroom.
Okay. I'm going to start with a misconception that I think is one that I hear most often, and I'm not even going to call it a misconception, because I think it's potentially a misconception, which is this is going to come and take all our jobs. It's the most difficult conversation we have. We all find it very difficult to talk about because we don't know how this is going to work. What we do know is that in the past, technologies have come along in newsrooms which have changed our jobs before, and they will do it again. And I think when I hear that misconception, the thing I feel most strongly, and apologies to Jane because she's heard me go on about this quite a lot, but I just feel like we need to just remind ourselves about the fact that this is an assistive tool, that we shouldn't be ceding our creativity to it or our journalism. Our journalism and our human experience is the most important thing we have. And if we can use AI to help us unlock time and effort and take data that will help us to do our jobs, that is fantastic. And if we can help it generate content in different ways to help reach different audiences, and we'll talk a bit more about that, I'm sure, that's fantastic. But the absolute soul of journalism, where you have an individual witnessing something, observing something, analyzing something, and talking to an audience, that is not something that we should be letting AI do at this point. I say at this point, I think for me that's quite comforting, and it's quite a good thing to have a conversation with newsrooms about. So that's probably the most powerful misconception. It's here, it's going to come in, it's going to take all our jobs, we're not going to have jobs, and it's just going to kind of churn out journalism. That would be a terrible, terrible use case. And I really hope that we can reassure people that that just isn't where we need to be going with this. And we have control over this, right? We don't have to let that happen. So that's misconception number one. I think misconception number two, and I won't go on any further, although there are probably many more, is that it's really hard to understand, because it's not. It takes some effort, it takes some reading, it takes some application. But if I can understand the very limited maths that I do to understand how these things work, then pretty much anybody can, because I am an actual functional idiot when it comes to maths. So if I can sort of get embroiled in just understanding the very basics that I need to know, I'm never going to code, I'm never going to kind of train models, but I can understand enough to make my job effective in journalism and AI. And that should be a lesson to anybody that, it's not impossible. It's easy to engage with if you're willing, if you're open-minded, and if you're not, just rejecting it because it sounds scary.
Ellis, what are some of the misconceptions or myths that you've come across across your newsroom?
I would agree with everything Laura said. Although obviously not the parts where she referred to herself as a functional idiot. I would not agree with that. Or as a robot woman, but that sounds much cooler, to be fair. So there's a whole heap, right? With anything like this, there's understandable nerves, to put it mildly, but also caution that needs to be applied, and that is the case. It does need to be applied, and hence why I mentioned before around having a very good sense of what structure from a governance perspective, or at least guiding principles that you will have as an organization for how it can be used and in what forms, and getting people very much onto the same page as to where it can provide huge opportunities and where it can be marshaled in a way which is going to inherently improve the efficiency of an organization, improve journalistic output, because you might be able to source stories that you may not have been able to do before. And I know for a fact that the FT, as our editor-in-chief said in an open letter and paper many months back, we will use it to mine data that are it's basically impossible to assess the sort of the depth and breadth of a story unless you get a handle of this. So we will do it to aid journalistic ambition and to inform the stories that we will publish. But those stories will be fundamentally created and investigated by humans, but they will be enabled potentially by improved technology, such as always been the case as technology has evolved, right? We've been using Google search or any other technologies for quite some time, and these have all enabled journalism. They haven't held them back necessarily. There are risks inherent in any new technology, so we need to be alive to that, and each organization will approach it in their own way. More practical risks or misconceptions, Tshepo, I'd say, I guess that they're quite tactical in a way. So things that we often hear are things like LLMs are fact-based. In reality, they're not. It's kind of, you know, a common adage in data, at least, is rubbish in, rubbish out. So if the data sets that they're using are not accurate, and this is where the risks will come in if you're using it to source stories, for example, there will be problems with the output. So fundamentally, they are not fact machines. They are a language model, right? So they are reading data and they're creating language off the back of that data. So it's only as good as the data sets they're using, and that is 100% the case for now, at least. Others that I can think of. I actually took some notes for this because I wanted to answer it in a good way. So yes, another one is around retraining. It's not an exercise which happens, at least not now, without the machines don't learn autonomously unless you actually retrain them, and that can be a very expensive exercise. And it links to the first point. It is about the quality of the input and the quality of the process that you use to apply to learn on that data. So these are things that don't necessarily have to happen, but it's a common misconception that it will suddenly just be spread across the entirety of your, say, journalism or the data that you write stories from, and it will be able to churn out verifiable information. It won't do. So the degree to which humans are hand-holding the process is going to be very, very, very much there for, I would suggest, quite a long time to come. But you never know what will happen in the future.
Jane, at a global organization like Reuters, what are some of the misconceptions, myths that you've been hearing from across the team?
Well, I think more than sort of myths and misconceptions, I think it's that this is all quite new and people are very busy in newsrooms, and they're not necessarily, you know, this group of 136, I think we are now, plus anyone who's then watching on demand. You know, we're really interested, we're leaning in, we're sort of learning a lot as it changes. I don't know about you guys, but I find it so difficult to keep up with everything that's written about AI every week, you know. And so for somebody who's, you know, writing about, I don't know, oil markets or something, it's not their main job, and so there's just a huge knowledge gap. And so I think there's a lot of training that we need to do, not really to combat myths, but really to teach people, as Aled referred to, like what these models actually are. So I think I don't want to sort of repeat too much of what the others have said, because I agree with it all, but I think I often hear somebody sort of playing with ChatGPT and they'll say, well, where did it get that from? You know, and it's like, well, what's the data? Because they're so used to using Google search that they think it's working like search. And as Laura says, you know, I think I'll be even ruder than Laura. One of my old trainers used to say, journalist plus calculator equals mess up. You know, it's like, so journalists of being, you know, we've tended, I mean, I think if we did a straw poll here, more people would come from a humanities background than a STEM or science and mathematics background. So getting people to understand what statistics is and what stochastics are is actually kind of quite important. You don't have to know, you don't have to have a PhD in it, but you have to kind of understand what it's doing. And as the brilliant Agnes Stenbaum will always say, the machine isn't trained to be right, it's trained to look right. And I always quote Agnes on that, because it's just like, that is just such a kind of a critical thing to remember. This is a stochastic model. It is aiming for something. If you know your Greek, your stochos is your aim, like, you know, so you're aiming for something, but it will get it wrong. And so that links to my second myth, is that there's one perfect answer that AI is going to give you. I mean, you know, that's the regenerate button, right? You know, it'll keep on trying things out until you like the answer. And it's not a silver bullet. It really isn't. So I think that's the third thing that I would kind of delve into a little bit, is that I think this links back to what Laura was saying about people worrying that it's going to take all of our jobs. Who knows in the future, but at the moment, to drive that thing, I talk about, and apologies to those who've heard this before, but I talk about sort of using LLMs as trying to drive a Ferrari. Like, you look at a Ferrari race car, you think it's got 4 wheels, it's got a chassis, it's got an engine, it's got a brake, I know how to drive, I'm going to be fine. And you'll get into that thing, you'll either bunny hop, you'll stall it, or you'll crash it. You know, you have to actually learn how to drive this incredibly powerful machine. You've got the basics, you understand the basics of how to drive, but to drive that sort of machine with that sort of power and that sort of potential, you have to train. And so that's one of the things that we've been really investing here at Reuters, is like training people. What are these models? How do you prompt? How do you get the best out of it? How can we put systems around, so the LLM type models to increase the power and the potential of these things to help us do the work? And so, you'll often hear people in the world of AI talking about a human in the loop, like, well, we need a human in the loop to make sure that the AI isn't going mad. I'm kind of talking about the other way around now. I'm sort of saying, like, where do we have the LLM in the loop? Where can the LLM be useful to us without it kind of going off wild, making up bizarre answers, hallucinating / making things up? So how do we actually harness that power of that Ferrari to get us to where we want to go, rather than being driven by the Ferrari somewhere that we don't necessarily want to go? So I think it's kind of understanding that these are incredibly powerful machines, but they're not magic, and they require us to control them. And I think that actually, I tend to find that once you start to get through that, people get really much more relaxed about the arrival of AI in the newsroom, and they start to see the real potential that actually this is, as we've been saying, this is a tool. This is a better way of doing some of the tasks that we do. And in some cases, it might be a worse way of doing the tasks that we do. So I think as you bust those myths, it kind of really helps to unlock a lot of thinking about how we might use these things in journalism.
Thanks, Jane. I'm getting myself a Ferrari just to have that analogy work for me. I like how all of you sort of have touched on AI literacy, and I'm interested and keen to know, how are you guys going about spreading that literacy within your newsrooms? So for somebody in a newsroom that hasn't started working with AI, how do they go about being that AI champion and making sure that that literacy is spread across the newsroom and other departments? Ellis?
Well, look, my advantage, as I said, it is from both understanding how the FT is adopting it, but also how we're supporting other newsrooms to do so. It is one of the biggest challenges, to be honest, and Jane put it perfectly, which is the base level understanding of it, just as a topic, is pretty low, although it's completely incredibly accelerating, as you'd imagine, but also the skills associated with using it. And I'm not just talking about Gen AI now or ChatGPT, but the other many forms that we've mentioned. Require specific training and require an understanding across an organization, and a willingness to learn it, I guess, as well. So even just getting through the cultural barriers initially, which I think we've all touched upon, is a big step forward, but they can be done. And so I think, we did a survey a few months back that across a load of thousands of news organizations and media executives, and they said about 96% of them responded that they didn't have a clear AI strategy. That's not necessarily a problem, because I think it's very difficult to have a strategy for something which is so amorphous and changing so bloody quickly. But what you do need to have is an approach to learn about it pretty quickly, because it will be a defining kind of skill set and attribute for the sector, and it will change the way that we all do the work that we do. So I guess how we done it in the softer sense, the FT is doing this brilliantly, and there is a sort of internal roadshow that's taking place, led by a mixture in a very cross-functional way, as the best initiatives are also are always executed, with senior editorial leadership, senior product and technological leadership, and commercial leadership as well, doing internal webinars and effectively, whatever the forum is, disseminating a new thing that they think everybody should be aware of and how it can be used. We do that with our clients as well, as you'd imagine. But so that is a very important thing. There is a central resource which, if it was not disseminated and socialized, would probably become quite dusty quite quickly, because people will revert back to the way they do things. But that is a kind of roadshow that the FT is doing internally, which is fantastically useful and a great testament to cross-functional collaboration. And that is a key thing here. It's not just journalists per se who should be using it. It is the news organization as holistically, and then you'll start to see the benefits of it. I'll leave it there for now.
Laura, how are you guys spreading AI literacy within the BBC?
Well, it won't surprise you to know that the BBC took a guidelines-based approach. So we started off by looking at, what is the guidance that we should be providing? And that sounds like a simple question, but it's been a very kind of interesting 6-month project to come up with something which is robust enough to be useful, but also able to move quickly, because as Alan and Jane both have said, this stuff moves really fast. So coming up with very basic guidelines to say, don't put your own, don't put your data in, don't put our data into these models. We know that's a dangerous thing to do. Don't use them on your BBC email, and be very aware of how these models work. So that kind of idea. We're still having conversations, quite understandably, with people saying, so basically, if I'm trying to get a picture out of one of these models, it's taking little bits of collage, is it, from all over Google? And you're like, no, that's not what it's doing. It's doing something completely new. And getting that information out there is quite a long process, and like Ali, we're doing a road show, because I think you can't beat a good road show. And I agree that a cross-functional team working on this, which we've now established, is a really good thing, because you need your people from legal and from data protection and data rights, and you need your people who are looking at the IP issue, which I see has come out in the chat. Very interested to talk about that. So it is a big conversation. It's a big cross-corporate conversation. The other thing that we've tried to do, which might misfire on us actually at some point, is we write a weekly newsletter, which we send to anybody who wants to know about this, and we try to make it funny. Okay, that's the bit that might misfire, because I think sometimes there is so much of this stuff, and it can be quite dry. So we try to make it really accessible. It seems to be doing okay, but I think making sure that you try to appeal to people in a way that isn't going to make them go, oh God, I've got to sit and read like 14 articles on hallucinations, is probably one of the secrets. And we have something called the Blue Room, which is our tech engagement space. We're very fortunate to have that. And the sessions that we run in there are very interactive. And we say to people, what do you think about this? How do you want to use it? What do you see as the opportunities? And some of the feedback we get from those sessions is brilliant, because it really helps us to kind of shape the debate about where this is going to be useful and where it isn't. Because it's very easy with technology that's new and that's emerging to sort of like come up with brilliant ideas that look brilliant at the time, which actually are potentially not necessarily the best use. So whilst we're doing kind of enterprise, license work, and working out how we can use these tools on a sort of fairly ordinary basis, we're also looking beyond that. We're very fortunate to be able to do this because we have an R&D facility to say, what's the research we could do? Where could we add to the conversations about safety? Where could we sort of build the knowledge graphs and look at retrieval augmented generation to help with, accuracy, and sort of build out some of that work, which is going to help us to learn how to trust these models in a more effective way. So a big combination of stuff, and lots of fun to be working on it.
Laura, do share a link to the Blue Room and the newsletter. I think some people may be interested in that. Jane, how are you guys spreading AI literacy? I know you're the champion there at Reuters. How are you going about it?
I haven't done a roadshow. I mean, what have I been doing with my life? My God, I need to do a roadshow at 9:24. So we've been doing various different things over the course of this year. So it's kind of gone in maybe 5 sort of steps, right? So the first, and similar to both the FT and the BBC, we came up with our guidelines back in about April. So it's just setting up the broadest guidelines, both internally and externally, to guide kind of how we were going to approach generative AI. Then the second thing was that we had a group of very early adopters, cross-functional team, working on a couple of proofs of concept to try some stuff out. So we actually had something that we could point to, whether it was successful or not, it almost didn't matter. It was being able to point to how you might start to play with these tools, measure sort of determine what your outcome is supposed to be. How do you measure the success of the machine versus the human doing that task, and the like. Then the third thing that we did was to start, and this is kind of where the literacy bit kind of starts to broaden out, is that we essentially decided to try and set up sort of a broad group of, if you are interested, so maybe this is the equivalent to Laura's Blue Room. If you're interested, come into this Teams channel. We're a Teams house rather than a Slack house, but come into this Teams channel, which is like AI experimentation and feedback. Come in, ask questions like, I'd love to be able to do this. Can anyone help me sort this out? Have a chat, share reading, etc. And that's really fostered a really nice little community of those very keen beans, the early adopters, but then also the next circle of people who definitely know that this is coming their way, but they're not necessarily the ones who are going to get their finger straight into the pie. But then what we've done, adding on to that, is that then we do a sort of bi-monthly call, newsroom-wide, to share some of the advances that have come through, some of the things that we've been doing. And those, company-wide calls here, sometimes get very low engagement, sometimes get very high engagement. I'm delighted to say that ours is one of the very high engagements because I think everyone's actually sort of truly interested in learning, because again, we work with very, very bright people. They all know that this is coming their way. They want to kind of understand what the wave looks like before they happen to surf it. so that was kind of like then the sort of the getting ideas, so getting really ideas from the bottom up, like what were people thinking, how are people thinking about it, and then we built on that a series of workshops essentially. So right, let's see what the ideas that you have for your job are. Now let's train you on how to use these models, a bit of prompt engineering, understanding, some training on that, some trying to kind of codify a little bit about, like, let's going back to my Ferrari, the driving manual, like how do you actually, get control of this and how do you use it? And then what we're trying to do after that, so kind of gone to guidelines, proofs of concept, so broadening out the communications piece, then doing this training, and then now the sort of the fifth piece of the puzzle that we're putting on is really starting to implement a few things within the sandbox, right? So we have our Thomson Reuters own version of GPT-4, so that nothing that we put in goes back out to Microsoft or OpenAI, and they can't see what our queries are. And we're really encouraging people to go in there and play. And because we know that the barrier to entry is very low, like what is the weather today is not going to get you a great answer on GPT-4. But if you actually have some examples of good prompts that actually do newsroom tasks, then people start to see what's possible and how to start using it. And that's been we only put those in place about 2 weeks ago. But it's been really interesting seeing people kind of come in and play with it to start understanding what's possible, how the prompts have got to the original text, to whatever the output is that we've asked it to do. And so that's kind of, trying to do a mixture of training, like here's an actual workshop, come and do some training, or this is on LinkedIn Learning, or this is on our training website, whatever, is one of the bicycle wheels. But then actually seeing it in action, I feel that that's kind of now what's really helping the literacy. It's like learn about it, but then see it in action and put it in action. It kind of becomes a much more virtuous circle. So people are not just keeping it in their head knowledge, but they're actually getting it into their heart knowledge, into their finger knowledge, into their journalism knowledge. But it's going to take a while, right? I mean, I talk about this, we've got 2,500 journalists around the place, and in some of their countries, and you talked at the very beginning about sort of being aware of cultural differences and the like. Well, one of the big cultural differences is that LLMs work very, very well in English, and they work really badly in some of the other languages, right? So, I think that's one of the things that we also need to be super aware of, and as we're rolling things out, is to be super aware of the cultural differences just in terms of how these models work for different colleagues of ours in different countries where they're dealing with very different inputs.
Cool. We've got just about 11 minutes left for the session, and I don't want to hog the mic. So if you do have questions, do pop them in the Q&A, and then I'll pass them over to our panelists. But before okay, I guess I could ask this one. Moritz Gratz, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. He's curious to know, how do you deal with data security when it comes to using ChatGPT and similar tools processing data and articles? Anybody can jump in.
So we've had a really interesting discussion about this over the last few months, and I don't know if any of you saw the article last week. I'll try and stick it in the chat, which was kind of evidence that the stuff that you put in, yes, it does wash up, and it washes up in chunks of recognizable, meaningful text elsewhere. We were always a bit worried about that. We kind of saw it as imagine being on a beach, you put a bit of driftwood into the sea, is it going to wash up on somebody else's beach in a recognizable way and tell people about what it is that you do? So enterprise models is the answer, really. As Jane was describing, you have to kind of have a system which is going to protect that data that you have, and it is a genuinely sort of big worry for everybody that has been starting to use these models. You particularly don't want sort of third-party data that you need to protect going out into those models, because clearly that is effectively a data breach. So yes, good enterprise deals, and then just making absolutely sure that people understand not to play with these things on email addresses where they haven't signed up to an enterprise deal and where they're using any kind of corporate information. I think is that a good summary, you two?
Great from me. Yeah, I was going to say exactly the same thing. Again, it's like what you're putting into it is incredibly critical, and so having very clear do's and don'ts around what information can actually be ingested, if you like, and there's nothing else I really can add. It's sort of what you put in, but also, like you said, the environment itself needs to be secure, so that it doesn't breach any of the, there's broader discussions that any major news organization is having as well in terms of how its content is being read. So that is a factor to be borne in mind as well.
Cool. I've got one more sort of a question, not a question, but Aaron is keen to know how they might use AI in story development. They're a small newsroom in Australia. Anybody can take that.
I can take a go, but my camera keeps on freezing, so I apologize. It seems that my internet connection is going wonky even though I'm in the office, but whatever, I don't know. In terms of story development, it's a really interesting question, and we've been playing a lot with just quite simple prompts, like, this is a story that we have written about driftwood, to take Laura's example. What are some of the other questions that people might have? What are some of the other angles that we might need? Because if you think about kind of what it's doing, is it's looking at the data that you've given it, and then it's making new connections across into other things. And so we find that actually even doing sort of some story brainstorming like that can spew out maybe sort of 10 ideas, of which 3 of them are rubbish, 2 of them are utterly inappropriate, but then 5 of them have a kernel of something that you can then start to work on. And I think it's kind of like, we've talked for many, many years, and we should continue to talk in journalism about being close to our audiences and knowing what our audiences want to know. And I think using LLMs as kind of a bit of a brainstorming idea, I've been doing it both on ChatGPT, but also on Microsoft Copilot in Word, and it's come up with really not bad ideas at all. We did it for COP28 to look at what questions do people have that they might need explained around COP28, and of the 10 ideas, 8 of them were really, really good. So it actually works pretty well statistically, kind of coming up with sort of like the next step that people might want to think about.
Cool. I've got one more. Oh, Elliot, go ahead.
So I was just going to add to that. Well, firstly, to agree, because another way of viewing what Jane was saying is you start with an actual tangible thing you want to solve for. And I was just seeing a few questions in the chat around how do you actually use this in a practical manner, and when do you start using it? I guess first you just start doing it, but start doing it in a safe way. Start doing it with something which is wedded to either a concrete user need or user problem, or an internal user need, if you like. So colleagues see an opportunity here. Let's just start by experimenting, then use that as a bedrock from which you can broaden out its application, I guess, in a holistic way. That was just a quick point.
Cool, thanks, Elliot. And I think we also might have a bit of I think if you go through our starter pack, it sort of gives you a guide on how to get started. And the question we always ask is, what problem are you trying to solve in your newsroom? And that way you're able to get started with using AI. I've got one more interesting question from Claire at BBC News Labs. What newsroom tasks are you really excited about applying AI to? Laura?
So I've got a bit of an aspiration here, which I think could be really good, but we do need to sort out whether we can trust this stuff first. And I almost kind of hesitate to say that, because that sounds like we're trusting a thing, and we're not. We've made this thing. We should know how it works. At this point, we can't trust it in the current format that we have it in. But I would love to see us being able to write stories for different audiences, and to be able to take what would be an enormous amount of journalistic time, rewriting something for audiences that might be very young audiences. They might be very, very news experienced audiences who want more stuff. They might be audiences that have English as a second language, all sorts of different kinds of audiences. And I'm wondering how we can sort of get our arms around potentially doing that, and then also using the automated journalism tools that we've been very used to using to get even more juice out of those stories. So could it help us to reach audiences we currently don't? That for me is the kind of like, that's the sort of holy grail, but I think we need a lot of work on making sure we're happy with the output of these tools, and making sure we have the right journalistic oversight before we do that. But it could save us time in that space, and it could be quite an interesting application, particularly as we work in this very difficult news ecosystem that we find ourselves in, very disintermediated.
Jane, what tasks are you excited about?
So, I mean, I totally agree. I think so reaching different audiences is really critical. And I was hosting a panel on AI in New York a couple of weeks ago, and it was really interesting hearing American publishers really leaning in the most to translation, because they realize that they've got journalism that they want to get out beyond their borders. And so for them, it was different geographical audiences, as we're here in the UK, it might be for the BBC, so different ages or different socioeconomic backgrounds and like. But I think for all of us, thinking about our audiences is kind of critical, right? That's why we're in business. As a B2B company with a B2C bit, it's also making life easier for our customers to use our content. So we launched a piece of AI-driven software earlier this year around Reuters video, which gives you an automated transcription and translation from all different languages into English. It will now add other language pairs as we keep developing it, which just speeds up using video for Reuters clients. It also gets away from lots of the search issues that people have when it's video, like, let me just find the Biden quote about, whatever it happens to be. Then it actually just increases our productivity and efficiency. And I think that is something that when you ask what I'm most excited about, this sounds a really silly thing to be excited about, but I'm really excited about saving our journalists time. I don't know a single newsroom that has enough journalists in it to do everything that they want to do. And I've got colleagues and myself, when people say, is AI going to take our jobs? I'm like, oh, I wish it would take part of it, because we're all working crazy hours in a really intense environment, and a more intense environment than ever before. And so if I can shave 2 hours off somebody's 14-hour day and they work 12 hours rather than 14 hours, that is a win for me, right? We've got to give you a real life example of where that's happening. Our Latin America editor gets a lot of copy in that's been written by people who are writing their second language. And so he has now a prompt that just does a quick cleanup of things into Reuters English style. And it's not perfect. It still definitely needs his editing done to it. But he reckons it saves him about 15 minutes per story. And you can imagine how many stories he looks at every day. So it's definitely not replacing his job, but it is definitely taking off some of that weight in the newsrooms and hopefully making our lives more pleasant. That in a way gives me a real buzz, because it's making people's lives better, whether it's internal to our own staff, external to our clients, or to their clients in terms of the audiences. But I'm a massive AI bull, so that's just a very, very small list. I could probably give you a list as long as my arm of things I'm excited about, but I'll shut up.
Elliot, go ahead. I know you guys have worked with a couple of newsrooms already as FT strategies. What are some of the exciting tasks that you've seen that newsrooms are looking to work towards?
Yeah, we have quite a few newsrooms now, actually. So as well as obviously working with the central FT, if you like. I mentioned at the beginning of the call, so I would bucket them into sort of 3 to 4 pillars: content production, audience engagement drivers, and kind of monetization, which is less, I guess, newsroom specific. But what we've touched on more, I guess, today is around the content production side of things. I can list out some of the areas which I think are very much opportunity areas, and completely agree with what Jane said. All of us are either journalists or have been journalists and can speak to what a very, very busy newsroom is like, and sort of the increasing demands of the newsroom in a digital world as well. So anything that can help us improve the efficiency and productivity is, from my perspective, a good thing, whilst making sure that we still have the safeguards in place to maintain quality. So listing a few of them: headline generation, improving generation of headlines in terms of driving engagement and likelihood to click through to an article; automated tagging; news gathering operations. So as I mentioned at the beginning, sort of sourcing data or sourcing stories through, I guess, far greater scale approaches than you would otherwise be able to do if it was only human-led. Ideation of stories, as Jane mentioned before; supporting on editing or publishing, and translation exercises. These are some of the things, and creative use cases into the future around large-scale fact-checking. I don't think it's there yet, but that could start to be quite exciting as well. From an audience engagement perspective, you can start to see it quite clearly in terms of recommendation engines, format personalization, comment moderation, which we're already seeing now some amazing startups which are doing some great work there in terms of assessing which comments you think should be kept on site or not approved, because we know comments are a particularly big driver of engagement. And then on the monetization side, you have a whole heap of things which will improve organizations' ability to convert subscribers or improve advertising efficiency or retain subscribers through dynamic or personalized approaches over time. That stuff is all very much in the market right now and has been for some time, but it's only going to get better as well.
Awesome. If I was a radio presenter, I'd be fired by now because I don't know how to keep time. But I want you guys to give me advice for small newsrooms or any newsroom. Just before we go, as we close off the session, what would be your advice to anyone getting started with AI? What's the one-liner that you'd give them? I haven't started. What can I do?
Play.
Say that again.
Play. Just
Play.
get out there and play. Find the inner child in yourself and just play. I think it's, I think we as journalists have rightly, a high calling towards accuracy and ethics and standards and everything else like that. But I think sometimes we kind of go straight in at that level of like, how am I going to solve all the problems, rather than just kind of going in with that sort of childish expectation and just playing and just seeing what's possible. I think, somebody in the chat, I was just trying to find it earlier, was talking about Google Bard and Ditto and Microsoft Bing. Some of these sort of the big models, which are also linked to search, are really incredibly powerful and actually quite good fun. So going on and just playing in your own life and just asking questions and everything, just to see how the model works and just to learn and to get it into your system the way that you would if you were a kid with something new. I think that's the way to then get lots of, we've given you our ideas. This is our route, but you'll get in there and then different things will come up to you as you suddenly try to make a cartoon, or you suddenly decide that you want to do all your Christmas cards or your New Year's wishes or whatever by AI, and all of those things will just get you thinking and get you thinking more creatively and with more possibilities. So I reckon just play.
Awesome. Jane says play. Laura, what do you say? What's your advice?
I absolutely back that up. And I think play by asking it about things that you know about, because then you'll see the limitations. So, ask it stuff that you understand, and you'll see that, my goodness, it doesn't actually know about that. It's telling me a load of, strange half-truths. So do that. And I think also just a really important one for newsroom managers and for people who are talking to newsroom managers about this: never underestimate the value of your own data, because there are a lot of people out there who want it and will try and do you deals on it. And you as a newsroom have incredibly valuable data. Do not sell it short, do not sell it cheap. I think it's really important to recognize that as we go. We haven't had the scraping discussion, but that's what I would say if we were to be going there. So just bear that in mind as you use these things.
Aled?
I echo both of those. What can I add which isn't play? Because that is 100% the sort of the gist for me. I guess experiment, do it in a way which is takes into consideration all the things we've mentioned, which is taking it with core principles in mind around safety, but ultimately it's there to experiment with and do it in a way which can improve your outlook as an organization from a productivity, proposition and efficiency standpoint. There's a lot to learn, but it's only going to get more interesting, I think.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elliot, Laura, Jane, for giving and sharing your insights on your time with us.